Hi, everyone. Mic is working. I'm Avishag. I'm VP of Product for OneLayer. Feel free to call me Avi. It's a little bit easier. And we'll be discussing demystifying device onboarding for private cellular networks. They can be PLTE, they can be P5G, but of course utilities, so we're focusing on PLTE networks. What are we going to discuss today in a little bit more detail? So first, a little bit about the evolution of private cellular networks and how this is probably something that you're all in the process of or experiencing different stages of. We're going to be talking about a little bit of the challenges that you're going to encounter along the way, focusing on the area of devices. We're going to do some terminology alignment so that we are all aligned on some terms I'm going to use across this presentation and what I mean when I use them, and to make sure that we get these points across. And then we're going to dive into onboarding cellular devices and also onboarding all those non-cellular devices that will be connected to your private cellular networks via some adapters like routers or others. And last but not least, we're going to discuss a case study. This is based on Evergy. And we'll sum it up. And of course, any questions at the end. So let's dive into it. Enterprise networks are transforming. You're all feeling this probably and through some different stages. But the world of enterprise for networking was very much IT-oriented and IP-oriented. You probably had those IT networks, cloud networks in some sort of way or another, data centers either on-premises in the cloud, your OT networks. But there, although all that underlying network infrastructure was pretty much similar and IP-based. And now you're adopting private cellular networks into part of that infrastructure. And this infrastructure is very different as compared to other networks that you're probably setting up. Suddenly there are antennas involved in the setup, different kinds of devices, SIM cards are involved, and that journey of adoption looks a little bit different than adopting different IT infrastructure. But with that adoption also comes different phases of what you need to incorporate into that process when you're adopting that network. So when you're in the piloting phase, you have a couple of devices in your lab, and you're just focused on, let's make this work. You want to make sure that this lab is running. You want to make sure that your network is something that you can connect devices to, and that you know that the technology is giving you the functionality that you're looking for. And as you start to scale that network to a couple of hundreds of devices, maybe a couple of thousands of devices, and you're moving to operations, your needs actually start to change. You need to be able to start to onboard those assets, not just manually by provisioning a SIM card manually into that HSS or actually onboarding and setting policies for your devices. You're going to have to start thinking about processes and how you can onboard those assets and maybe even delegate between different teams, because you're now not just going to onboard one or two devices. You're probably going to want to provision a couple of hundred SIM cards a day and maybe even onboard several devices in batches. And maybe you're even moving towards thinking about scale. Maybe your phase is, I already have a couple of thousands of devices, and now we're talking about scaling that network. And you want to make sure that you're not just automating, but also having tools in place for checks and balances. You're also monitoring what is happening with all these devices in your network. You're getting alerts. You're not just consuming some visibility. You're also being able to incorporate maybe your SOC or some other team into the process so that they can start receiving and taking action to be able to manage your devices at scale. That action is incorporated across different teams. So teams are probably going to be involved in this journey and have different goals at different phases of this journey. So the first team that we usually see involved in this journey is the operational team. Initially, their goal is, I just need to use this network. I just need to make sure that I can onboard one or two use cases and just make sure. But as it scales, they want to be fully independent in operating that network. You don't want to be dependent on your core provider or on your cellular network provider. You want to be able to be extremely independent in this process and, of course, automating those processes so that you're efficient in your operations. the security team is probably going to be involved. Maybe not initially, but we have seen more and more security teams being in the earlier stages of adopting the network to set some, let's say, goals from the get-go. But initially, let's just make sure that we have the fundamentals. Maybe some configuration of routers, maybe some configuration of devices, make sure nothing can be accessed that shouldn't. But as you start to scale this network, it's going to have to adhere to your corporate standard. Maybe you'll even need to adhere to NIST or to NERC-CIP to be able to manage this network efficiently and securely. So as you're adopting the network, you're going to have to incorporate more and more practices of security into this, and again, automate those so that you can handle the scale. And last but not least, you have your networking team probably involved here. And initially, again, the goal is, I just need this network to work. Let's just make sure everything there is running. And they start to incorporate more and more automation processes so that you're not dependent on any full-time employee in any process that you need from a networking perspective. And of course, at the very, very end, you need to support scale. Either it's a couple thousands of devices, maybe it's going to be tens of thousands, maybe you have a vision of smart meters everywhere in 10 years from now, and you're talking about millions of devices as well. So you're going to have to be preparing for that scale from an infrastructure perspective, from security perspective, and of course from an operational perspective to be able to ship out and provision their SIM cards. So I want to kind of break down the world of onboarding into into a few different parameters. So first of all, the core, the RAN, you have those set up for the sake of this. And now you're starting to look into those different user equipment devices, your cellular devices. They can be your UEs, they can be your CPEs, but those are the cellular-oriented devices. They have their SIM cards in them and the devices themselves that need to be taken account when onboarding. But it's not just that in a cellular network. There's also everything connected behind your cellular router that needs to be taken into account, especially from an onboarding perspective. These are actually non-cellular devices that are going to be connected to the cellular network via some adapter, via that CPE. And there's also the process of onboarding those, whether you are accountable for them or not, that's a different question. You might be working with subsidiaries, you might have the accountability for it, or not, but still these are devices that are going to be connected to the network. So even from a security perspective, if not from an operational perspective, there is risk introduced because they're using that network, and you're going to have to be at least accountable to make sure that risk isn't being exposed given those assets. So what we're going to be covering in this talk is 3 different onboarding processes. First, it's the SIM cards for all those UEs and CPEs. And then there's the process of onboarding themselves, the cellular devices, and last but not least, those non-cellular devices as well. So 3 parts to this onboarding process for any asset that is a device connected to the network. And as I promised, terminology. So when I talk about onboarding, what do I mean? When I talk about provisioning, activation, et cetera, what am I referring to so that we're all aligned? When we talk about provisioning a SIM card, what I'm referring to is making sure that the SIM card keys are provisioned in the HSS or in some secure location. It doesn't mean that we've yet set a profile for that SIM card. It doesn't really have an IP allocated to it, quality of service, a PLMN, none of that. We're just talking about making sure that those keys are set somewhere. You probably received that batch of SIM cards from your provider, and you're storing them in a secure location, ready to be activated whenever you're ready for that. And of course, deprovisioning means I'm removing those keys from that database, and I'm probably not going to be using the SIM card anymore. From an activated perspective, this is where you're going to be setting those different parameters for that SIM card. What quality of service assigned to it, the APN it should be using, or maybe there are multiples. Is there an IP? Should it be set as dynamic or static? And all these different sort of parameters that you want to associate with that SIM card. And of course, deactivating a SIM card, meaning I'm just moving it back to a provisioning state so that I can change the context of the card and its profile in the future. So these are the states that I'm going to be referring to through this talk, and that's what I mean when I'm referring to any one of these. In addition, I want to make a differentiation between SIM management and asset management and device onboarding. So SIM management is very much, let's say, an MNO approach. MNOs, they don't really care about the devices themselves. From their perspective, they're more interested in the SIM cards. They bill according to the SIM cards. So they don't really need the device context when they're talking about managing assets connected to a network. But as we move towards the world of enterprise networks and utility enterprise networks that are PLTE oriented, you're going to be looking more at the device perspective and asset management that's more comprehensive. SIMs and devices. It's not just the SIM card itself, it's the device itself. Is it a Sierra, is it a DG, is it a Multitech, or is it a Cisco? Any one of these amazing vendors here that are providing devices. Those devices are part of the assets that you are going to need to manage. And you're going to probably set different profiles for different SIM cards according to these different assets that you're connecting, because they're going to be needing different services. And when we talk about device onboarding, or when I talk about device onboarding, I'm referring to the end-to-end process from SIM provisioning to SIM activation to validating that this SIM card is in the right device with that right profile, and of course, in the end, devices that are non-cellular at all connected via a device to the network. And the automation of processes within that device onboarding is also what I'm thinking about or referring to when I talk about device onboarding. And now we're going to focus on the different areas to keep this a little bit structured. The first area we're going to dive into is onboarding the cellular devices that have SIM cards within them. And the next talk will be focused on the non-cellular devices behind cellular routers. So for those UEs, the major challenges that we've seen from different utilities and different stages, of course, of the process of onboarding those cellular devices to the network is first, as the network scales, you'll need to be able to support more and more SIM cards and provisioning and activation of those in bulk. Initially, when it's in pilot phase, people can do this manually. Probably have a couple of spreadsheets, a couple of scripts running, and you're running a couple of things there, and you have that provisioned, you have it activated, and there's probably some full-time employee that's the only one that has access to the core to be able to do this. But as your network scales, you're going to have to start using tools to be able to do that in bulk. You're going to be probably receiving a bunch of SIM cards that you've ordered from one of your providers, and then you're going to want to be able to provision them and activate them in different stages, probably with different teams, which leads us to one of these additional points and challenges, which is you no longer want to have that single point, that single persona that's in charge of all the process that won't help you scale. You need to be able to delegate these steps to different teams. Provisioning, activation, validation, sending things out. You're going to want to be able to also incorporate this into your automation processes, which is another huge challenge. The more manual work it is, the more error-prone it is. The more human error can be incorporated into this. If I set the IP statically, manually, for each one of my SIM cards, there are higher chances I'll probably create some IP collision and spend a couple of days trying to figure out how do I fix this. And I'm actually referencing some real active cases that we've seen happen. So you need to be able to automate, to integrate with additional solutions like IP allocation tools, to be able to streamline this process. So this is a lot of pain here that actually falls on very specific people. And you can't manage that when you're looking at thousands or hundreds of thousands of devices. And last but not least, this is a major gap we see within the device provisioning process. Today, all the tools out there are very much focused on SIM cards. And the core, it looks like SIM cards. At the IMEI and the IMSI, those are the identifiers that you see for the device and the SIM. But that doesn't actually mean that you have the context of the device. Let's say I provisioned a bunch of SIM cards, I've activated them, created some profiles, and now they're to a certain set of devices. Who's to say they actually reach those devices? I've sent a bunch of, let's say I've sent 200 SIM cards into the field, and now there's another 200 devices there, and somebody has to sit and match them and make sure that they're actually in the right devices. That's not a process that can scale. So one of the things that's really missing there is a way visually and automatically be able to identify the SIM card is in a DG, in a Sierra, in a meter, in any sort of controller that you have out there, and the profile that was set for that SIM card is actually the one that's supposed to be applied to this type of device. So the device context is crucial within this process, and it's a huge gap in many of the cases within provisioning, and that's part of the challenges that we've seen as part of this process. two major components that need to be considered within this process. And we talked a little bit about differentiating between the operational team and the security team. But there are two, let's say, zero trust and zero touch approaches that we see are becoming more and more best practice oriented for utilities as they provision and onboard devices. First of all, you want to make sure that you are adopting a zero trust approach for your device onboarding, that you can actually do this streamlined, and the devices, when they are activated and provisioned into the network, those SIM cards, they're actually born into a secure environment. The devices probably will already have policy set on them, even segmentation policy set on them, to be able to make sure that they're only communicating with what they actively should be communicating within the network. So there's the process of making sure that you're taking a zero trust approach. These devices should only be communicating, accessing, talking to what they should, and everything else should be prevented from the get-go. It supports a higher standard of security and adheres to a lot of those compliance best practices like NIST and NERC, etc. And from a zero trust approach, you want to eliminate as many as those manual processes along the way as possible to be the least error-prone as possible. So the zero-touch approach says, I want to streamline this process end-to-end of provisioning, activation, validation, sending this out to the field, and making sure that all of this is automated as much as possible while keeping the zero-trust approach in mind. So what's the blueprint for success here? You want to be able to walk through these following steps. You want to be able to provision your SIM cards, and this is the must-have steps, of course. You want to be able to provision your SIM cards and activate those devices with those SIM cards within them. That's the very, very basics. When you're going to start out, you're going to be wanting to create some processes around these for sure. As you scale your network, you're going to start adopting more advanced processes into this. And the next phase is usually the ability to create some modifications of those profiles as you learn more about what you actually need. And these devices are already in the field with the SIM cards in them. You're going to want to be able to profile modifications for the SIM cards based on the context of devices. Maybe based on location, some geofencing, maybe based on the device types, maybe based on how these devices are communicating or different policies that you're adopting. In addition, you're going to want to be able to authenticate those devices and set those segmentation policies to make sure that they can only communicate with what they should, especially if your cellular network is not an island and connected to the IT network or OT network or your data center. Meters need some server to send data to. So all of this actually needs to be streamlined into segmentation processes as part of the advanced processes of onboarding. And last but not least, you'll want to be able, at scale, to receive event alerts and then take action based on that. Let's say you're not practicing SIMlock and somebody replaced the SIM. Maybe you want to automatically deprovision a device. Maybe there's an event that's a geofencing event. A device was moved from a certain location to another location where it shouldn't actively be right now, and you want to be able to take action on that. Maybe somebody replaced a device behind your cellular router, and in that case, you want to be able to deprovision that router because now there's some risk introduced into the network and that wasn't authorized. So being able to take action based on events in the network is the last phase of this and usually what is adopted at scale. And of course, automate all these processes as much as possible. Diving a little bit into each, and don't worry, we'll be sharing this. And I know it's the end of the day, and everybody's tired, and drinks are on their way. So I'm going to be trying to go through this a little bit quicker. So the SIM provisioning process, what does this actually mean? You want to be able to provision the SIM cards and store the keys in the HSS or some other secure location and make it ready for activation. Make those SIM cards ready for activation. You also want to be able to maybe integrate with your SIM provider, whoever that is, to receive that shipment file digitally, those keys digitally. Maybe it doesn't have to be put in an envelope together with that batch of SIM cards. You'll also want to be able to integrate with the core provider and do that in a secure manner because you're going to provision SIM cards. So you're going to have to be doing this in a certified way, not just some employee writing scripts and accessing the HSS of your production network. That probably wouldn't make sense at scale. And you want to be able to assign a specific team to this specific step of the process so that you know who's in charge of this process, who's accountable for this process, and then, of course, making sure that if there's anything around provisioning that needs attention, have the right people in place. For activation, this is the next phase. Maybe this is a different team completely that's in charge activation phase for your SIM cards. At this stage, this is where you're going to want to be able to set some parameters for these SIM cards before they are shipped out into the field, or even before they're into a device. You're going to want to be saying, okay, so this batch of SIM cards should have a set of APNs assigned to it, quality of service, should it or should it not be able to roam, should the IP be static or dynamically set, and a bunch of other parameters as well. Maybe at this stage you're even looking to set some SIM lock capabilities here. And you want to consider some critical capabilities of SIM lock. Do you actively want to lock this SIM to a specific device? Maybe you don't even know what device this is eventually going to meet in the field, so you probably won't be able to practice that at that point. Or do you want to be able to automate this process upon first attach, or even based on context of devices? So there's a lot of things to take into account at this phase. And of course, you want to be able to achieve the ability to automate and delegate this step as much as possible. Again, integrating with the core to be able to set these parameters that with your cellular core provider. That again means you probably want something that's authorized by that cellular provider to do this, and be able to apply those different approaches for SIM lock. And let's say that SIM card was activated, shipped into the field, and instead of going into your DG, it went into your Cisco IR. Maybe the profile that you meant to set for the DG is very different than you had meant to set for your Cisco IR. The profile and all the quality of service that you were set. You'd want to be able to make context-based modifications to that profile now that you know where it actually ends up in the field. It's either you say, okay, it's in the wrong device, I'll shut it down and go figure this out later. Or you can say, now that I have the context of this asset, maybe I'll just adapt whatever I had preset to where it's actually ended up in. And that's one of the key considerations as well here. So again, being able to set all these parameters, but based on the context of the device that it eventually ended in. And last but not least, so we're talking now about the devices. We've streamlined the process of SIM cards. And now we're looking at the device itself. That Cisco IR, the DG, the Multitech, whichever one of these amazing vendors here. And you probably want to be able to set policies for this device. Again, especially if it's communicating cross networks to your IT network, to your data center, be able to integrate with your existing security solutions, like your firewalls, your NAC solutions, to be able to set policies and make sure that these devices are only communicating and accessing what they should. And that is probably a phase that is completely on the security team. You want to incorporate your security team into this process. It's no longer operations or networking. It's a completely different team that needs to be involved in this process as you consider onboarding. And as I had mentioned before, last but not least, you want to be able to take action. Deprovisioning is an example, but you want to be able to take action on those assets as you scale based on events. Deprovision them if you need to provision SIM cards based on interesting alerts. Maybe even not necessarily deprovision, but leverage the firewall that you're using to set some isolation rules, block rules, to be able to manage those assets. There's an interesting event taking place. And again, this is probably maybe a security or operations team responsibility, so you want to be able to delegate this step as well and keep it all as part of your process. Okay, so I'm wrapping up the part around UEs, cellular devices, and SIM cards. We've covered the whole process from provisioning to activation to context-based modifications, some segmentation to take into account there, and last but not least, deprovisioning based on events. That's the recommended best practice and blueprint that we've built together. G is an amazing reference for us for this, and the use case I'm going to show later is based on them. And this is things that we've learned with them together as they have scaled their network and are learning to onboard devices. So that's the recommendation for, or the best practice, the blueprint for onboarding your cellular devices. Let's talk about everything that's happening behind them. So you have a bunch of CPEs running, and now you have IP devices that are non-cellular connected to your cellular network via those CPEs. The cellular core has no visibility into that. Your cellular provider has no visibility into that. What they see is that SIM interface, maybe the IP of that cellular device, but whatever's happening behind those routers, no one knows. So the first thing you've got to do there is make sure that they're not hidden devices. You want to make sure that you have full visibility into everything happening behind them. Even if you're not in charge of them and controlling them, you probably are, from a security perspective, responsible. If there's an incident that originated with one of those devices that's now spreading across the network, that responsibility probably falls on your security team. So you want to be able to understand what's connected to the network and should it actually be connected to my network, even if it's not a cellular device. So the next part is, of course, being able to authenticate those assets. If it's a LAN connection behind a cellular router, even if it's a Wi-Fi connection, it's very easy to replace. I can just take the cable, move between two devices, have something else connected to my network. Who's to say what that is? So you need to be able to authenticate those devices behind the router into your network as well and authorize them to connect. That's a huge gap, especially if you don't have visibility. So these are huge challenges, and there are still best practices being built to manage that. And of course, so most devices today are not cellular ready. Most of your devices will be connected via that cellular router to your network. So you're going to be needing to practice all of this at scale for all those different assets. So what's the blueprint for success here? Don't worry, less steps here. And then you're all off for drinks. So the must-haves here. First and foremost, you want to make sure you're authenticating that cellular router. That's the very first step. You want to make sure that you have those cellular routers certified. It's your DG and not your... Just using examples here, nothing against them, just to make sure that those are exactly certified devices that you want on your network. Second, you want to be able to identify and visualize all those assets connected behind those routers. Maybe it's one-to-one, maybe it's one-to-many connected behind, but you want that inventory in place. So that's the very, very first step. Knowing what you have is the very first step. Second, as you move towards more advanced processes, you'll want to verify that whatever is actually connected behind that router should be. It can be an access control list. It can be something that you're getting from, I don't know, your Cisco device. Doesn't really matter, but whatever you're authorizing, whatever other solution you're using to get to take record of that inventory of what should connect, you want to make sure that that's exactly what you're seeing. And last but not least, you'll want to be able to take actions, perform things like the equivalent of a SIM lock. Maybe it's a MAC lock. You'll want to lock those devices to those routers or to those group of routers and make sure that only that certified list is actually what's connecting and not just leave it at the alert stage. Of course, automation throughout. Yes, automation throughout. So authenticating and authorizing a cellular router, I'd say that this is the very, very first step, and we covered it around the SIM provisioning. We covered it around activating those devices. And then you'd want to be able to authorize them. So making sure that they're in that list of your authorized devices, and you'd be able to do this by either integrations to existing asset management solutions in your network or by leveraging some access control lists that you have. Identifying those hidden devices behind your routers. How to gain visibility there is a huge challenge. So each one of these provides their own asset management system, and it's a good question. Do you want to have all these different solutions running? Maybe you're going through a lot of different vendors and then there's no single pane of glass there. So you want to find a way to extract all that information from all those asset management solutions and centralize it in a centralized location. So you'd want to have one place that's your source of truth. So incorporate all that into a single location, whatever asset management you're using. But you'd want to also make sure that you're keeping a log of any changes of what's happening behind them. Again, not still taking action, just visibility. So those MACs that are those MAC identifiers of those devices behind your cellular routers, you can get those from the routers themselves. You can get from those router management solutions. But you'd want to keep a log of that, and you'd want to keep a log of any changes there, again, in a centralized location so that you'd be able to automate the processes of taking action when that comes into place. And the best place, the best we recommend to go about this is to make sure that you're enriching your existing asset management solutions, your CMDBs, maybe your ServiceNow, maybe your Maximo, whichever asset management you're using, just making sure that you're logging that correlation between whatever is behind the router to the router instance in that asset management solution that you're leveraging. And now that you know what's connected to your network, you want to make sure that it's actually authorized too. So you have that list of MAC addresses, you have it in correlation to those CPEs, those cellular routers, and now you want to make sure that that list is actually that list that should be connected to your network. So the best way that we've seen so far is to go to one of solutions, some policy setting solutions. That's where you'd want to set the policy of what should actively be connected, set a list of all those, let's say, MAC addresses of what I actively want to have connected, and be able to compare both of these. Again, a lot of automation processes of integration between these two sets, but think about it like two lists. You have the list of what's connected, and you know to whom they are connected. You have the list of what should be connected. You want to be able to compare that once you have those two lists in place. And then, of course, once you make sure once you have the ability to identify what shouldn't be connected to your network, that's where you'd probably want to start taking action and perform action maybe even on the routers themselves, manage the whitelist, the blacklist, router firewalls. Maybe even you'd want to be able to leverage deprovisioning events, right? So you've seen that the MAC change behind one of these CPEs. Maybe your goal isn't to block that specific device now from communicating, but you'd want to deprovision that SIM card of that CPE. So make sure that whatever action you're willing to take is built in so that you can make sure that if something that's not supposed to connect to your network actually isn't. So that's the last phase there. Okay, so a couple of highlights to wrap this up, and then happy hour is supposed to start. There are 3 areas of device onboarding. 2 areas are incorporated into the world of the UEs and the CPEs, so the cellular devices. First, it's SIM cards. It's just part of the process. Once you're done with your SIM card device, with your SIM card provisioning and SIM card activation, you'll want to be able to look at the devices themselves and make sure that those are onboarded, those cellular devices. Once you've done with that process and you're feeling confident in that, you're going to start looking at everything behind those routers to make sure that those are the devices that actually should be connecting to your network and making sure that nothing unauthorized is actively connecting. And if there are any changes, at least be able to be notified on them and make sure that those are the changes that you had actively aimed for. So I'll talk a little bit here about customer case study. So we've been running with Evergy for quite some time now, and don't know if you guys had the chance to drop by the booth. But Evergy needed a way to manage their growing number of assets as they scaled their network. And you've all met JJ probably and Don, and they can probably tell you so much more about this than I can. But the issue for them was that they have all these different devices, cellular routers mainly, that have devices connected behind them to the network. And as they were starting to provision the SIM cards, and we're starting there in the pain, as they started to provision the SIM cards, they understood that there are so many different processes to provisioning and activating the SIM cards that require a lot of manual work. People need to set the keys within the HSS. That's a script that somebody needed to write. And once that was written, what if something breaks? What if there's a change? What if the file that you received in your shipment file from your provider, something very small changed there, and then you have to go and change everything within your scripts again? And you're dependent on that one person that knows how to access the HSS. It's not software. It's just some Python script that was set. And think about this. This is a production environment, and somebody is running queries versus the core. So that's all on its own a huge issue. And then as part of your activation process, you need to set IPs for your SIM cards. And again, it's a manual process without using some tools here. So the manual process actually created a lot of human error, some IP collisions in many cases. And now you got to go and figure out that this is the problem, that with one of those, you've provisioned a bunch of SIM cards together, let's say 50 or maybe 20, and one of them has an issue. Now you have to go figure out which one that is and what's the source of that issue. And all of that is extremely manual. It was an extremely manual process. That's the area of the first phase there. And let's say everything went smoothly. Let's say they went through the process of provisioning and activation, and that went smoothly. And now the SIM card went all the way into the device. It's not the right profile for the device. Now the device isn't actively working exactly as they expect it to, but according to the spreadsheet that they were using, it's the right SIM card that's supposed to go into the right device. But when you go into the details of that profile that was set for the SIM card, they actually found out that it's the wrong profile that was set. But it's now already in the field in this device. So they had to be able to make updates based on the context of the device, now that they know what it is, to have it actually functioning. So all of the pains were actually identified along the process, and things that we've learned with them together along the way. So that's just to walk you through the provisioning part. Now we're extending towards those devices behind the cellular routers with them, and we'll give you more insight as that progresses. And I invite you to as well to learn more about the pains. There are things that I'm comfortable saying, and we feel less probably. At this part, I'll stop for any questions if there are. Yeah. Amazing. So I'll just repeat the question for everyone. So there was a question here regarding geo. So how does that fit into the process of onboarding and securely onboarding and making sure that that is well streamlined? So the best way to incorporate geofencing into the process, as far as we're aware, is to consider the location just another parameter of context of a device. So a device has context, and context can be live. It's not just what kind of device this is, it's also where is this placed. And when this device is placed in a certain location, you'd want to be able to learn and set parameters for that device as part of the process. So when you're going through that, let's say, authorization phase for that device, at that phase, you'd want to set the policy to say, this device is authorized to communicate only from a certain geofence. That's part of the context you'd want to set for that device. And then as you move into the area of taking action based on events, once you've set that policy to make sure that the context for that device also is in relation to location, at the event stage, you'd want an event to tell you, it's out of context now. It's no longer within that location. Let's take action if that's what we wish to do. So that's where that would fit into the process. Any additional questions? Okay, so as far as I know, happy hour should be starting in a couple of minutes, and I hope you all had a wonderful event. And if anybody has specific questions, you're more than welcome to reach out after. Thank you.